He stepped out for a bit. At least, that is what it looked like. The door was left open. The truck was in its place. Keys, phone, wallet, right where they were supposed to be. On the table stood a cup of morning coffee. No cream. To an outsider, it means nothing. But for those who knew him, it looked like the day just stopped. Not in a rush, not in panic, but in the middle of ordinary movement. He was not planning to disappear. He was not saying goodbye. He was not leaving hints. He was 75 years old, and he had known this land for decades. He navigated it not by map, by memory. This was a place where he did not get lost. That is exactly why the question does not sound the way it usually does. Not what happened to him, but what could have seemed so ordinary to him that he did not think he needed to come back right away. Because sometimes the most dangerous stories do not start with alarm, but with the feeling that you just stepped out for a bit. Utah, high plateau, private land bordering wild, poorly marked territory. Not a tourist spot and not deserted, more like a transition zone, where people show up rarely, but regularly. Hunters, guides, rangers, property owners. There is no feeling of the edge of the world here. That is exactly why the disappearance was not perceived as something extraordinary for a long time. The man was 75 years old. He was not a random person in this area. According to data collected by journalist Madison Dapchevich for Outside Online, he had known this region for decades. The terrain, seasonal trails, weather behavior in November, zones where signal drops out, and places where you can catch it. He navigated it not by map, by memory. For him, this was not the wilderness. It was a workspace. Such people do not say, "I'm going into the wilderness." They say, "I am stepping out." Mid-November in Utah is a deceptive time. During the day, the sun still holds, and it seems like winter is somewhere nearby, but not here. At night, the temperature drops sharply, the ground becomes hard, the sound of footsteps changes, and the wind starts behaving differently. It is not just cold, it is cutting. That day, he went out alone. Without hurry, without alarm signals, without the need to warn anyone, he was on his own land and near it. The last confirmed actions contained nothing alarming. No calls, no messages, no signs that he expected trouble. When he did not return, it did not become alarm. It became a pause. People who knew him did not think about the worst precisely because he was the kind of person who does not just disappear. In places like this, experience is the currency of trust. And he had too much of it. The search did not start right away. And when it did, it was predictable. They checked the usual route, stopping places, shelters, points where he had stopped for years if the weather started breaking. Nothing. There were no traces of an emergency departure from the route. No abandoned gear. None of that chaotic picture left by a person losing control. Unnecessary climbs, pointless descents, signs of panic. He did not behave like someone who got lost. Days passed, then weeks. They found him on December 9th. In a press release, the San Juan County Sheriff's office reported that Pachak's remains were discovered on the morning of December 9th in a pond located on his property. Update from December 10th, 9:30 a.m. Mountain Time, and it was not where they had been searching. The remains were found on his own property, but far from the route, the camp, and any logical stopping point. This place was not considered difficult, not considered dangerous, and, most importantly, had no reason why an experienced guide would go there alone in November. For professionals, this became the key moment, because in stories like this, there's always a trail of logic, even if it leads to a mistake. Here the logic cut off. Official statements were cautious. They found no signs of violence. No catastrophic weather was recorded during those days. The cause of death did not give a simple answer. This was not a story about a man who could not handle it. This was a story about a man who should not have ended up where they found him. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous, not mystical, but disturbingly real. When the searchers reached the place where the remains were found, the first feeling was not shock. It was confusion. The place did not look like the final point of a fight for survival. There were no steep cliffs here, no narrow canyons where you could fall, no signs that a person was walking on their last legs, choosing the shortest path to salvation. This was a place you come to by choice, not by necessity. For experienced people, such details mean more than official statements. A guide, a ranger, a searcher, they all think the same way. Why did a person end up here? Not a single standard scenario fit properly. First hypothesis: weather November in Utah knows how to break plans. Sharp cold snap, wind that steals your breath, snow that seems harmless at first, then erases tracks within hours. But in this case, weather did not explain the main thing. If he was escaping the cold, he would have gone down toward shelter, to familiar points, to a place where you could start a fire or wait out the night. He went in a direction where there were no shelters and no sense. Second hypothesis: physical failure age is a factor that cannot be ignored. Sudden drop in blood pressure, disorientation, a cardiac episode. But even here, there remains a mismatch. People who start feeling bad do not go deeper away from the route. They stop, or instinctively return to where they came from. He kept moving, and moved far enough to end up outside the usual search zone. Third hypothesis: error in thinking the most uncomfortable version. The one professionals do not like to discuss out loud. Sometimes experience starts working against a person, not as a lack of skills, but as excessive confidence. When you walk the same places for decades, you stop checking the obvious. You make decisions faster, you doubt less often. But even this hypothesis does not fully close the question. A mistake should leave a trace. Here there was none, and it is at this moment, when logic stops being a reliable support, that it is important to look wider. Contrast: the taiga of Krasnoyarsk region almost at the same time. On the other side of the world, a completely different story was unfolding. Krasnoyarsk region, taiga, impassable, cold, indifferent to human plans. A family of 3, mother, father, and 5-year-old daughter, went hiking without a guide. Not extreme sports enthusiasts, not survivalists, just people who overestimated their preparation. Weeks passed. Search teams combed through kilometers of forest. There were few traces, even fewer solutions. Here everything was clear from the start. The mistake was obvious. The risks were known. The ending was disturbingly predictable. But that is exactly why this story matters. In the taiga, people disappeared who lacked experience. In Utah, a man disappeared who had more experience than needed. And the result turned out frighteningly similar. When two such cases exist close together in time, an unpleasant conclusion emerges. The wilderness does not distinguish why you ended up in the wrong place. It does not give breaks for age, for professionalism, for confidence. It simply waits for the moment when you step beyond the limits of your own logic. And in the story of the missing guide from Utah, that moment has still not been found. Because the most important question remains unanswered. What made him turn to where there was neither necessity nor salvation? There is a moment in every search operation that rarely makes it into reports. It is not the discovery and not the failure. It is the moment when people start mentally walking alongside the missing person. Not as rescuers, as him. They try to understand what he saw in front of him, what he heard, what he might have decided in seconds that later stretched into hours. If you gather all the confirmed data, the last hours of his life look disturbingly ordinary. Nothing points to a sharp turn of events. No storm, no fall, no situation that would have forced impulsive action. That is what scares the most. Imagine a typical November day in this part of Utah. The sun is low. It does not warm. It just shines. Shadows are long, and the terrain starts looking different than it did in the morning. Sounds become duller. Even footsteps on familiar ground sound foreign. For a person with experience, this is not a reason for alarm. This is a familiar state. But it is exactly in such moments that something happens that is difficult to document after the fact. Not a mistake, but a micro-decision. Turn the wrong way because I have been there before. Continue the path because I still have time. Do not stop because everything is under control. These decisions leave no traces. They do not look like risk until it becomes too late. When they found him, the distance from the usual route was enough to ask an uncomfortable question. Was he walking there consciously or by inertia? Professionals know disorientation rarely begins with panic. More often, with confidence. You do not get lost immediately. First, you think you know where you are, and if at this moment something goes wrong, a failure in perception, a brief loss of bearings, a physiological episode, a person can continue moving without realizing that the logic has already broken. It does not look dramatic. It looks normal. Perhaps he understood that something was wrong too late, or perhaps he did not understand at all. At this point, searchers often say one phrase they rarely speak out loud. He did not look like a person who understood he was dying. This means only one thing. Until the very end, the situation did not seem critical to him. That is exactly what explains the absence of desperate actions, the absence of attempts to urgently return, the absence of distress signals. He was not fighting for life. He was continuing to walk. And when a body is found in a place where there is no logical explanation for its presence, it speaks not of mysticism. It speaks of how thin the line can be between control and loss of bearings. In the wilderness, there is no moment when an alarm sounds. No clear transition from everything is fine to dangerous. There is only silence and the feeling that you still have time. When it comes to cases like this, professionals try not to build theories out loud. Not because they do not have any, but because every theory forces you to admit this could have happened to anyone. That is exactly why in the story of this guide from Utah, there is no single official logic. There are several lines of thought, and not one of them fully closes the question. Version 1. He heard something in wild terrain. Sound works differently. It travels farther, it gets distorted by the landscape. It can seem closer than it actually is. Sometimes people follow a sound unconsciously, not as if toward danger, but as if toward a task. Experienced guides know the difference between natural noises and something unnatural. They know what wind sounds like, what animals sound like, what emptiness sounds like, but they also know something else. If a sound does not fit, it needs to be checked. It could be a voice, could be a shout, could be a sound similar to human movement. No one is claiming this is exactly what happened, but the very fact that he ended up off route forces the question: what could have seemed important enough to step away from familiar logic? Version 2. He saw something he did not expect. Experience does not mean omniscience. It means patterns. You know what usually happens. And that is exactly why the unusual stands out more strongly. Tracks that should not be there. Movement where it is usually empty. Changes in a familiar landscape. Sometimes a person goes to check not because they feel danger, but because something does not add up. And here appears the most disturbing moment. An experienced person rarely perceives this as risk. He perceives it as a work task. Version 3. Helping this is the version that is rarely spoken about publicly, but often thought about privately. Experienced people in the wilderness know if someone needs help, time works against them. And if you can check, you check. Can a person turn off route to help someone they did not even see clearly? Yes. Can they overestimate the distance and conditions, thinking this will not take long? Yes. And can this decision, made without alarm, become irreversible? Unfortunately, also yes. And here again arises the silence between facts. Because if he went to help, then who? And why was no one else recorded in this area? Version 4. Nothing special, the most difficult version to accept. Precisely because it gives no comfort. Perhaps there was no sound, no vision, no person who needed help. Perhaps there was simply a small deviation, a couple extra minutes of movement, a decision that did not seem like a decision. Sometimes a person ends up not where they should be, not because something big happened, but because nothing happened in time. And all of this brings us back to the main point. When a body is found in a place where an experienced guide should not have gone, the question sounds not as what went wrong, but as what at that moment seemed right to him. After the body was found, the search did not end immediately. It just changed form. People kept returning to the route, compared distances, matched up times, tried to reconstruct not the path, the thinking. But it is exactly here that the limit of any investigation emerges. In the wilderness, a person rarely dies because of one mistake. More often, because of a chain of unnoticed, normal decisions. He did not do anything extreme, did not walk into a storm, did not break obvious rules, did not ignore a threat. He simply ended up in a place where his experience stopped working as protection. And this is the key point of the entire story, the most dangerous moment. When there is no alarm, yet almost all survival stories that end tragically have a common feature. The decisive point passes before the feeling of danger. Not when a person is freezing, not when it gets dark, not when strength runs out, but earlier, at the moment when everything still seems manageable. Experienced people rarely die because of panic. They die because of the confidence that panic is not required yet. That is exactly why this story is so unsettling. If even a person who has known the terrain for years can turn without obvious reason, continue moving without noticing the deviation, not register the moment when logic failed, then it means the threat does not start with the external environment, but with the internal feeling of control. Bluff is a tiny town in Utah, about 250 people. A place where everyone knows each other by name, and any deviation from the usual rhythm immediately becomes noticeable. This is exactly where, since 1989, Joe Pachak lived. For him, it was not just a place of residence. According to those close to him, he felt a deep connection with this southwestern corner of the country, with the land, history, desert, art. Here everything was intertwined: past, nature, and man. That is exactly why his disappearance became so heavy for those who knew him. He was not a person with suitcases packed. He was a person rooted. Joe was last seen on the morning of November 18th. What comes next is what knocks the ground out from under you. He did not show up at Cow Canyon Cafe, where he was supposed to meet friends on November 24th. He did not appear at 2 Thanksgiving dinners planned in different places a few days later. For a small town, this is not just strange, it is alarming. When people came to his home, the picture was frighteningly calm. The door was open, wallet, keys, phone in place. His old truck was still parked on the gravel driveway. And, a detail that makes you uneasy, on the table stood a cup of morning coffee. No cream. For a person who joked, loved rituals, and never skipped morning coffee, this looked like an action cut off in the middle of movement. As if he stepped out for a minute, and did not return. According to Lynn Osler, his former partner and close friend, this was an unprecedented disappearance. He did not leave without words. He did not vanish. He did not disappear from his life. The search was massive. Helicopters, drones, service dogs, even the pond on his property was drained. Nothing, his son Rainey emphasized. His father had become more careful with age. He did not take blind risks. He showed no signs of dementia or impulsive behavior, and everything around said otherwise. A few days before the disappearance, Joe bought land, transplanted plants, connected water to the house, planned a new meditation practice. These are not the actions of a person who is planning to leave. These are the actions of a person who is planning a future. And it is here that the story becomes truly important, not as a mystery, but as a warning. The vital lesson of this story: danger in the wilderness rarely begins with a threat. It begins with normalcy, with an ordinary morning, with a cup of coffee, with the feeling that you are home, even when you step out the door. The most dangerous moment is when a person does not feel risk because everything is too familiar. Because he has been here. Because he knows this place. The story of Joe Pachak shows not the weakness of experience, but its shadow. This lesson cannot be ignored. This case does not teach, do not go alone. Does not teach, always take a radio. Does not teach, fear the wilderness. It teaches a much more uncomfortable thing. Experience lowers alarm faster than it lowers risk. And if you know a place too well, are too confident that you still have time, have made similar decisions too many times without consequences, you enter a zone where danger becomes invisible. The most vital skill in such conditions is not navigation and not physical fitness, but the ability to stop before it becomes scary. To ask yourself not, what am I doing? But, why did I decide this was safe? Why answers may never appear, we will most likely never know. What he saw, what he heard, what seemed important enough to him to change direction. And this is not a failure of investigation. This is the reality of the wild environment. Nature does not record reasons. It only records consequences. But that is exactly where the value of such stories lies. They do not give instructions. They give limits to confidence. When a listener closes this story, they should not think, this will not happen to me. They should think something else. At what moment would I also not notice that everything went wrong? And if this question arose, then the story has accomplished its task.
Thank you for watching, guys. See you in next video. Bye bye.